if you have an expertise in something and this book represents that expertise, then just drive into that as much as possible and do not try and find customers that aren't going to be interested in what you're doing.
Derek runs Blue Crow Media, which is a super interesting small niche publishing business. They write essentially tour books, but in the form factor of maps. So things like brutalist architecture in Paris. These kind of like fun ways to investigate a city. But what's most interesting, I think, and the reason I wanted to get Derek on a call, is the way they set up their logistics and distribution and printing system. The way he built his own retailing network from scratch by skipping the big bookstores and building individual relationships with cafe owners, design shops, museums. And then once he had that distribution network, he was able to shift from being the author to being the publisher. So now they work with a bunch of different specialists and experts going city by city and expanding. Super cool business. Derek is very thoughtful about the product, the creation, the publication, all of that. This isn't the traditional author interview, but I think there's a lot to learn.
So the first publication was an app for finding specialty coffee shops in 2011. So you have to remember, this was a time when there were like 20 specialty coffee shops tops. So it was a great time to have done that. It was right when apps were kicking off. And it was also when, everyone was talking about apps, but there weren't really any useful ones for everyday use. So, I had a boring job. I started doing that and I started going around coffee shops. Of course, I had no idea how to publish an app. I've worked in online publishing for a long time, but I'm not a developer. So I had to find a partner to do that with. And fortunately, I had a friend who had a team of developers and he was looking to transition into apps at that stage.
The reverse technology journey, right? You went from apps to books, or you were using the books originally as a publicity stunt to sell the apps, and then the books ended up as the business? Or how did this whole journey work?
You have to remember, I'm in my mid-40s, so I'm the perfect place for print and digital to be either complete mysteries to me or like the format really doesn't matter to me. And in the sense that I'm an expert in neither. I look for something that can just overlap very nicely. So originally I was doing the apps, and the trouble with the apps I discovered quickly is there was no monetary system. The pricing system for a niche app was terrible. Everything was geared towards something that was going to be a shoot the moon style app. So I couldn't sell an app for 99p to 3,000 people and expect, my life to change. Actually, my life has still not changed. The point being is that it wasn't going to work. And neither could I price it at £10 because then it would have been the Rosetta Stone of apps and it would have just sat there at the bottom of the rankings and that would have been game over as well. So I started making these small folding maps, which essentially had the exact same content that the apps had, but I could put a price on it and the cafes could sell it right next to the till. And it was, where all their friends had cafes. And these were all sort of small independent cafes. So they were quite supportive of one another.
So when Derek says maps, these are almost like travel guides or like beautiful kind of art books, but they happen to be printed and manufactured in kind of unfoldable map shape. So think high-end, local, explore the city, discover the city. You basically set up your whole own publishing and distribution flow to deal with these?
From the coffee shops, bookstores started carrying the maps. I started doing the same thing for craft beer, which was also kicking off then, and in cocktail bars and all that sort of stuff that at the time was a lot of fun. I mean, I think it's probably still a lot of fun, but I have 2 older kids, so I'm running after them.
You've skipped over a couple like small impossible steps, such as, and then all the cafes and bookstores started stocking these things. You had no traditional publisher. You sort of built these relationships yourself. How did this work?
Essentially, it went from walking from one cafe to the next. But I think the benefit at that stage is because that industry was so small, they were all so supportive of one another. And every cafe, it was the owner was the one making your coffee. It wasn't a situation where you had to knock on the back door to talk to the manager or something like that. It was so easy to meet everyone.
What specifically were you asking them? Did you walk in with a pile of your publications and say, hey, put these somewhere?
At the time, I had no expertise in coffee whatsoever. So I had to present myself at a little bit of a distance. I couldn't let them know that I didn't know what the hell I was talking about. So I came up with this game where I overdo everything. So for the coffee app, rather than just, having like the sort of review that a Time Out would have of a coffee shop, I started writing about the different coffee machines and the models. And I got super detailed because obviously coffee people love this stuff. And the whole machinery side of it is a big part of it. And so that got me talking to all the people working in the cafes and the potential sellers of these guides. And then they probably realized I wasn't a good enough businessman to take advantage of them. And so like the trust was built right there. It was like, okay, you own a coffee shop. I'm going to be a publisher for the rest of my life. Like neither one of us are going to win in this game. So let's like, see what we can do together. So I think that's how that initial step started. And then obviously it spread from there, and what had once been 20 cafes became 100 cafes, but the people all sort of remained the same. The baristas in one cafe would go start a cafe somewhere else. So it was quite an easy network to keep up with everyone.
So at this point, you've got, 20 cafes, and then people spread to 100 cafes, and they're basically acting as your bookstores and your distributors, Absolutely. Right? Because they're giving you shelf space.
They were making 50% of it as well. But the important lesson there is I was doing the same thing for craft beer. And then the bars started selling the maps as well. But of course, I'd get these phone calls. Someone's just poured a beer on a stack of 150 of the maps. Can we just get some new ones? And it was like, I can't just replace them. Like, surely we need some sort of system in place here that shows that there's some respect for the product. But the coffee shops were perfect. And then I think the coffee shops also led to putting a lot of merchandise on their shelves. And I think they realized around that time as well that was going to be a revenue stream for them.
Would your kind of bespoke go to the cafes, go to the museums, go to the stores, get them to stock your book? Does that still work today?
Yeah, I think it has to work. Part of it is just finding the right person to talk to. And a shop like Foyle's, there'll be 15 people, and it's worth leaving your book with all 15 people on different days. And someone will say, oh yeah, I've seen this, but it doesn't matter. It's the same with publishers. It's just finding the right person, that recognizes your idea, my work. My mom also rides the tube with my maps out in front of her for everyone to see. So there's always that advertising technique as well. I have often been tempted to just put my maps onto shelves in shops that don't sell them, just to see what might happen there. But I haven't been brave enough to do that yet. But give it a try. Let me know how it works.
Did you do the design and the writing of the early ones yourself?
I should have hired people right off the bat, but initially I did all the writing myself, and I attempted to do the same for other cities. I'd like fly over to New York, but of course, it doesn't work when you show up, particularly if you show up from London and are telling people in New York where all the good coffee shops are there. They're like, who's this guy? I definitely wrote them in the beginning and then quickly realized that if I worked with people who had a level of expertise in it, it had further legitimacy. With the coffee guides, I was doing it myself in the beginning and slowly passed it on, mostly because I enjoyed it and it wasn't really that hard. And then the subsequent guides, I'd hire people who had either an expertise or were journalists, or now doing the architecture guides, they're mostly academics. They are legitimate experts at this stage, simply because architecture is a field that you can find experts who aren't architects, whereas it's very hard to find someone who's a specialist in craft beer or coffee that doesn't work in the field and has a commercial interest of their own. I would say my success rate of working with good people has been about 99%, and that I've been very lucky with. Some of the time I've been able to sort of work through acquaintances for them to introduce me to people who are experts in something. So there's some level of vetting going on. Occasionally you work with someone that you think, right, this was good for this project, but I'm not really looking forward to working with this person again. And that's that. But for the most part, I've been very lucky. And
what's the actual creation process? Do you start with the illustrations? Do you start with the prose? Because they're super high quality, both in terms of the design and the content. Like, what's your process for ensuring that these things are good and you don't go crazy while building them?
I come up with a title. So let's say right now I'm working on a guide to alleyways in London. This guy and I were chatting. He's an author. He's written a few books and he's quite well respected. He has this sort of interest, and in particular during lockdown, he was walking through all the alleys in London. For some reason, he was doing it at night. I'm not really quite clear why he was doing that, but he was sending these amazing photographs of these sort of empty alleys all over London. And I thought this would make an interesting map. This is something that hasn't been done as far as I know. It's sort of niche enough that will allow my product to stand outside of other products. Early on, I realized if I do titles that haven't been done because my expenses are so much lower, this is my office, then I can get away with doing titles that a proper publisher wouldn't get away with. And simultaneously, I'm not printing in 50,000 copies in China and having them come over. I'm doing it all locally. So it allows me to get away with some titles that I wouldn't otherwise.
Can you talk about the printing and the distribution, the logistical side of it? Because for me, I just slap them on Amazon print on demand and I sort of forget about it and boxes magically arrive places.
Early on, I realized that things like the paper quality were going to make a big difference. Because they're folding maps, a lot of people are accustomed to picking up a map in a hotel or something, and it's free. So this was the initial challenge I had, how to make something that someone else is making for free. That's obviously not as nice, but I have to make it very clear that it's not as nice. And one of the ways of assuring that was to use really nice paper. So the paper all has a nice texture and feel to it. The printer we use is in the UK, it's in East Sussex, and they're a family-owned printer, and everything they do is like as far above the board as you can. They're all B Corp certified. They use vegetable inks. But all of these elements come into play when you're handling the product. You can actually pick it up in a shop and it's like, oh, this feels different than perhaps the pages in your book that are printed on demand that might have a sort of glossy or sort of flimsier feel than this paper would. I had to do that in order to sort of show that this was the quality that's tactile.
It's clearly working, because to come back to what you were mentioning about pricing power, an app has no pricing power. You get yelled at for trying to charge $1. And like with a book, we talk all the time where it's like, if something is a book, you can charge $10 to $20 for it. If you take that same content and you position it as a blog post, like no one's going to pay you a penny. It feels like you've done a brilliant job.
The prices are sort of in between £8 and £10 for a single product. The pricing is hard, but I knew right off the bat, because I'd failed with the apps, that I had to price it at a high enough amount that would allow me to have a little bit of wiggle room to advertise or whatever I needed to do. And I certainly remember the first time I did the exact same thing with this map that I did with the coffee maps, is I just walked around to bookstores in London and I just delivered it and said, if you're interested in this, here's my card, please get in touch. Some of them were already selling the coffee maps like foils and the Barbican and the Tate, so that I had my in with those. But the sort of high-end architecture bookshops, who am I to sort of walk in? And I do remember one of them telling me right off the bat that I'd priced it too high. But since then, they've never complained. But it was that initial sort of, oh, what is this product? It's not a book, but it's priced like a book. It's hard. But equally, being an independent publisher, if you don't price it high, you're through, because I can't compete with what you're doing with your product. There's no possible way. So I think, the printing and production is super important to get right. I work with a single designer, so there's a sort of theme going throughout all of them, and they look recognizable, and you can tell that it's a product from my publishing company. But then the editors and photographers change for each project. Sometimes I work with the same ones, but for the most part, I work with whoever the local the best architectural photographer in Buenos Aires is, for example, or something like that. And I've been very lucky that people seem to be happy to work with me. So far that, no one's outed me as an asshole or something.
You give people a profitable way to create these dream projects, right? This what would normally be a vanity art piece, you've kind of found a business model and a distribution for.
Also, if you're an author, you want to be published. I also like to try and work with up-and-coming authors and photographers as well. They're often do twice as much work as everyone else, which makes the process much smoother. But again, it's obviously there's a level of legitimacy that has to be met.
When authors come to you, Derek, do you have any suggestions for either the outreach from author to bookstore, if bookstore retail presence is valuable, or from author to kind of niche indie publisher like you are? What are some lessons learned here?
I should also preface this with, for the most part, I'm commissioning and I'm finding who I want to work on it rather than an author coming to me. So I'd say about 90% of my products are like that. I don't know how that is across the industry, but I do think that if it's a smaller publishing company like me, they probably know exactly what they want and they're probably looking for it. However, that said, there are certainly authors that come to me and three things happen. One, it's immediately, sort of lava flows out of the volcano and it's like, oh, I gotta work with this person. This is a terrific idea. And we usually have an agreement in place within a week. It's super quick. There are the back burner projects where people will come and I'll think, okay, maybe this would work if I started doing a different series. In that case, the problem is timing. I'm sort of kicking the can down the road for a year to see if that series begins to sort of take shape. Or if maybe, I come up with some other titles that would work with the title that author suggested. Then there are friends of friends who those are difficult. There's a lot of can kicking on that one. And I know some other publishers that would really work well for this. And then there are the projects that are beautiful that just won't work for me. But those I try and be really clear with right off the bat. Say, this is a great project and you should definitely continue to try and get it published, but I'm not the one for it. When I get an email, I recently had an email from a young woman who I'm doing a project with on signage in Hackney. It's not a project I would normally do, and it's also not a title that I'm convinced will be able to sell to the point that I need it to. However, she was so organized in the way she approached it. She'd done all the work. It made it quite easy for me to say, okay, this is worth taking a risk with.
Do you do any sort of structured market research, or is it really just intuition, or do you have a sense of why some products work and others don't?
I know when a product won't work, and I still publish some of those. I've spent a fair amount of time in Eastern Europe. I like cities in Eastern Europe. And so, I've done titles for Belgrade and Skopje, which I'm not going to sell enough to cover the expenses. But for me, it's an important one to publish. It adds legitimacy and it's meaningful to the people there who worked on it. But in terms of market research, no, it's hard. There aren't too many guides like these. There's a couple of other publishers, but they're more popular, I think, than what I'm doing. It'd be sort of the architecture of New York or the architecture of London, which is, obviously that will sell. but it's hard to get a grip on what will work and what won't work. What definitely has been a lesson learned is what works for London won't necessarily work in New York, and what works in New York won't necessarily work in Tokyo. And that's been a difficult lesson to learn over and over and over again. But that's the fact of the matter, and that's the way it goes.
You mentioned series. Is that because is it an organizational thing for you where it's helpful to do multiple publications on the same theme, or is there something about the cross-selling or the bundling or the business model side of it that means you need to do more than one thing of a thing?
Initially, I was doing food and drink for about 5 years. Then I've shifted into architecture, and I left the food and drink side behind, and I've been doing architecture for about 6 years now. And what's nice about that is you know exactly what to focus on, who to develop relationships with in terms of bookshops and that sort of thing. How to run advertising is really simple because you're really geared towards the same audience over and over again, and you can really build into that. Advertising in magazines and that sort of thing, again, is simple. And it's worthwhile because you have a lot of titles that might be interested in somebody. So last year during lockdown, we printed a guide to the great trees of London. And again, I had no idea if this was going to be a success or if my current audience was going to have any interest. And it did really well. The current audience who were interested in 20th century architecture, quite niche 1960s, 70s concrete architecture, are also interested in trees. And it's like, oh, okay, great. And of course, why not? Like, there's no reason why you can't be interested in one and not the other. You're living in a city and you're visually attentive to what's going on. This next series I'm doing that includes the alleyways will include things like street signs, and it's sort of non-architectural guides to London, but there's still a visual element. I'm trying to stretch it out. We're also publishing a book this September about brutalist architecture in Paris, which is a bit more academic than most of the other projects I've done, but it will have beautiful photography. So it will appeal to people beyond the experts. I think keeping a theme is pretty important. I think you can get lost otherwise.
And you probably also get some benefits. Like, you get to know the experts, the artists, the writers, the academics in that niche. So you can get more out of those relationships once you found the right people. What about reader relationships? When we first talked ages ago, it seemed like you were doing everything through the bookstores. Now you've got a super polished website. It looks great. It ships all over the place. Do you have a sense of the breakdown between retail channels that aren't yours versus direct sales? And do you do anything with the reader relationships when people buy directly from you? Do you tell them about new things?
Again, I'll preface this with the app in the beginning. And the app customer relationship is the worst relationship I've ever experienced in my entire life. First of all, you have no idea who anyone is who's buying the product. Apple doesn't give you any insight into who's picked it up. Secondly, you get, especially in 2011, you get an email every day with someone asking you how to install an app onto their iPhone. And you think like, oh God. And then you get a series of complaints about, why the mapping software doesn't work because they haven't turned their location on or whatever it is. It wasn't very nice. The nice thing about print is people generally don't get in touch, which for me is great because I don't have the capacity to respond to a lot of customer emails. And I do when I get them, but I really don't have time to be really nice and email every day and then take it out on everyone else around me. But in terms of the bookstore relationships, I now work through a distributor. I have a US distributor, a UK distributor, a Russian distributor, and an Australian distributor. And so initially I found most of those bookstores to sell to, and then they've taken on the warehousing and the interaction. And it's much easier that I don't have to send invoices and I just get a monthly payment. Obviously they take their 25% cut, so that's not great. But
so do you print everything from the UK printer who you know and trust, and then you ship to the distributors in other countries?
Yeah, essentially it starts with this UK printer. They're called Generation Press. They ship to the warehouse in London. It's called Turnaround. They're sort of a leading independent publisher distributor. And then from there, I ship to the other distributors and ship to a fulfillment center in Northampton, which sends out from website orders. So I don't touch anything anymore, which took a long time to get to. It's been a great lifestyle change not to have to keep up with Royal Mail prices and this sort of thing. As a tip that I just remembered, if you're publishing something on your own, if you're self-publishing, one of the hardest lessons I learned was that you want to make sure that the product fits into standard packaging. If you have a product that's an odd shape or is slightly too large, because you want it to stand out, you're screwed when it comes to the packaging because you're going to end up sending what could be a first-class letter. This extrapolates and it causes problems with boxes. So standard sizes are great. Look them up, know about them, just, think about them all the time. But I think in terms of customer relationships beyond complaints, obviously I send a newsletter about once a month when we have a new product or a discount or something. And that's definitely the most valuable tool I have. The newsletter is far more valuable to me than social media. Maybe word of mouth is the most valuable, but that's my bread and butter. better for online sales.
Are you just sending kind of product updates? Like we've got a new map that we think you'd like, or are you kind of going the whole, let me educate, inspire, amuse you?
I think my customers are probably more intelligent than I am, so I don't think I'm going to be able to teach them very much. For the most part, they're architects or they work in the field. Obviously, I can hire people to help and write things that do have a level of expertise. But 90% is just, hey, we have a new map out and here it is. And people buy it. And that's how the company works.
It turns out there's magic when the product is good.
And also, if you don't make it shittier as time goes on, which I think a lot of people do, I think if you can maintain the quality, then people are happy to come back. That's my pro tip.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Teresa is asking, how do you brainstorm and pick the themes of the publications or the series?
I spend a lot of time spinning around in this chair. I have a list in my head going back about 10 years of titles that I've wanted to do for a while. Again, some of the ones I do don't work, some do. But, for example, a guy's got in touch with me from Sofia, and he's an expert in 20th century architecture there. And it's like, oh, yeah, I'd love to publish that. But am I going to sell more than 500 copies? I don't know. I really don't know. I won't. But it's, okay, so when is the right time to sort of publish some more popular maps that, of course, I have to think of, and then squeeze that one in between? I'll go to bookstores and look around and sort of see what looks interesting, or if there are any authors doing original things. But also, I think just sort of surrounding yourself with interesting people. London's an interesting city, and walking around, you sort of start to notice things that you might not have otherwise. That often leads to things. If you're in northern Spain with just one other person who's not very interesting, then the internet's a great opportunity.
I've been noticing that my best creative breakthroughs always come after these periods where I feel like I've been goofing around and procrastinating for a while. It's always these idle weeks or months, and then suddenly something good happens.
I think what's really good is if you feel a sense of desperation. I think that's when you're on to something really good. You have to sort of hit rock bottom regularly.
That's the tip of the day. There you go.
There you go.
If you had to give a tip to us who are new to selling books online, what would you advise? I'm sure you've seen some successes and some failures.
Again, I'll preface this. I'm working on a book of fiction right now, and I have no idea how anyone could possibly sell a novel. It really is a complete mystery to me that someone can market a novel. So that's the extent of my imagination in terms of how I can answer this question. I would definitely say that if you have an expertise in something and this book represents that expertise, then just drive into that as much as possible, and do not try and find customers that aren't going to be interested in what you're doing. And I think, one of the early lessons I learned with running sort of advertising on social media was there's just as much a benefit of someone not being interested in the ad than there is of someone being interested in the ad. I mean, Rob, you're like an expert in this. Don't worry about the people who aren't interested. And also don't worry about the people who have anything negative to say about it. For every 99 compliments you'll get one negative comment that will make you feel terrible. And the 99 compliments will never help. That's just the sort of rule of the game. But if you have an expertise, that's it.
I love what you said about being comfortable excluding people or saying who the book isn't for. And I think about this so much because a little therapeutic exercise I've started doing is looking at the 1-star reviews of my favorite books by other authors. I can't examine neutrally the 1 stars from my own books, but if I read a book and I'm like, this is amazing, I go check the terrible reviews. And almost always I'm like, wow, this person should never have bought this book in the first place. The wrong person read it, right? That's the mistake. It's not that it's a bad book. It was somehow like mismarketed and the wrong person picked it up.
I've heard authors say, I don't know if they're being facetious or not, that a 1-star review, at least they're getting a reaction. There's nothing worse than like 2.5 stars throughout. And that's also with specialty coffee. Some people hate it. And that was great because then you'd have these comments of people who really liked it and they'd sort of up the whole system. Same with brutalist architecture. A lot of people hate it. And I can understand why, but I happen to like it, and a lot of other people do, and that sort of debate sort of helps.
Another thought based on what you did, and I did something similar with my first book also, where I didn't have direct access to the readers. So it was easier for me to build like one-on-one relationships with the venues. In my case, it was conferences. So I would find niche industry conferences, get chatting with the organizer. Often I would have them read like an early version. And then in some cases I had to give books away, but only if they could guarantee it got into everyone's hands. And in other cases, they'd like pay for printing costs. So I wouldn't leave with any money in my pocket, but I wouldn't lose any either. And that was kind of like maybe a similar thing to your relationships with the early cafes.
You're obviously much better at presenting yourself publicly and you're comfortable with that. I'm much happier as a publisher sort of not having my face be part of anything. I've done some events. Events never work out financially. It's the booze costs never cover the same.
I never sold books by being on stage, interestingly. Even if I was giving the keynote, it's like just not worth the time. What worked for me was getting the books included in the welcome bag or getting the organizers to include them with like, hey, welcome to the conference. Here's a book.
Yeah, we'll keep that in mind. That's a good tip.
Any other examples of series and how they're linked? You said a series of architecture in London, 20th century, and then how it connected to the tree theory. I don't think you were the one who thought of the trees. Someone brought that to you?
Yes, that's true. Paul Wood is the author, and he's written a few books on trees in London. My father is a tree guide at Kew Gardens, and my father's been telling me to do this map for like 10 years, and I was like, no way, Dad, it's not going to work. And then this guy like literally just, showed up in front of me one day, and I thought, oh, well, this is actually a really good idea. So that's how that one sort of played out.
And what were some of the others that you would consider like thematically related to that?
Essentially, my strategy, if you can call it that, is if something like the tree map works, I'll try and replicate it in New York and Paris. Essentially, for anything travel guide oriented, London and New York are going to be 90% of your sales. Everything else is just sort of there to make it look like you have a lot more publications. So the answer to your question, the London tree map, I published a New York tree map, which has done well. And I've been trying to publish a Paris trees map for about a year now, but there was a problem with the photographer. And I'll try and do the same maybe for Tokyo as well. But then how I can extrapolate from that, I don't know. That's a series that I don't think I could do. Shrubs of London, or even like parks of London would be too obvious. There might be something else there, but the architecture is good because, you can do Art Deco, modernism, brutalism, postmodernism, contemporary. I try and find one sort of pillar that I can hang everything on. I think if I was a bit more creative, I could come up with something good, but I think in reality, I try and keep it pretty tight to what I'm doing. I don't have a lot of money, so I have to be careful about what I'm doing. I can't publish 50 guides and just say, okay, that one worked and the other ones didn't. So I really have to think things through.
What's the production time, or if you're willing to share a cost for one of these? Because for me, writing a book, for example, it takes me a long time. I'm a slow author, it turns out. Yeah. It's like a year on a lucky one. And we talked to someone, Patrick Potter, who does you call it like interactive books, like workbooks, where it's like prompts, right?
Right.
And so he says, part of his secret is that he can put out like 6 books a year because there's not that many words in each of them. Right. And a couple of them have hit and sold 10 million copies.
I don't think anyone's spending a year in terms of the editors and photographers I work with. For the most part, the editors will be an expert in the field already. And sometimes they've already published a book on it. So they'll have the content. Obviously, they have to make it original, but a lot of the content is simply, this is the name of the building, this is the architect and year, and quite basic details. There are some people who just turn it around in like 24 hours. They're amazing. And those are people that I work with again and again and again. They get what I'm doing. They can visually look at the product and say, okay, this is what I should deliver. Whereas other people, maybe they don't have as much experience writing and they need a little bit more help, which is fine. The photographers, this all depends on weather and light and what have you. But there isn't an enormous lead time. It's just some projects take longer based on what else the editor might be doing, or if a building is under scaffolding or something along those lines. But some projects I can turn around pretty quickly.
I've been like kind of running this mental experiment, and we've been talking a lot in the authors group as well. It's like, at what point does a book stop being a book? Like, how much can you strip away and reduce to kind of make it an easier challenge where it still feels booky? And I think you're showing a pretty extreme example of that, because like you've got the book pricing, you've got the distribution through the book networks. It's clearly like mentally anchored in people's heads to book, not to map.
But I think the benefit of it is that it's something that works better as a map than it does as a book. For example, we have a Brutalist Paris map and we're publishing a Brutalist Paris book. The book will be on people's shelves, whereas the map goes into someone's bag. They walk around and they pull it out occasionally, and they're like, oh, in a new neighborhood or something. And it's just something that you can just fold up and stick in your pocket. So in that sense, I think that's been the great benefit of it. I can certainly remember when I was first doing the coffee maps, customers saying, why would I want this? I have the app. But then there was like a slow realization that there's something fun about walking around with a map. There's something nice about walking into a cafe with a map in your hand, and the cafe's like, oh, hey, you got one of those. And there's a sort of connection right there. If they're photographs or illustrations, you can get rid of a lot of text. You can probably get a book done in 6 months if you get a good illustrator involved.
I'm sure I'll go equally crazy, just like faster. I somehow always lose my mind toward the end of a book writing process. You're writing a novel, right? What's it doing to your daily organization? I have the hardest time switching from deep book writing mode to more like overseer, deal with a bunch of tasks mode. And when you're wearing your publisher hat, you must be more like, dealing with lots of projects or acting managerial and responding to emails. And then like, how do you handle the switch from there into the deep work.
I have 2 kids. So as a result, I have a finite amount of time, and that works really well for me. So essentially, I wake up early in the morning, 6 o'clock before they're up, and I write until 7:30 when I wake them up. And then after I've done the drop off, then I'll do my proper work. And I do that till lunch, and I stop working at lunch. And I'm pretty focused. And then after lunch, I do tasks. Maybe we'll try and edit something I wrote that morning. But it's not easy. But equally, I like what I do, and I enjoy writing as well. I think if I didn't like my work, I think it would be really problematic. I mean, essentially, I want this company to work so I don't have to do something else. This is a good lifestyle for me. I can travel. I can do interesting things. It's great. The novel is just pure narcissism. Will be out of me soon, and we'll sit at the bottom of the bestseller list, as in not on the bestseller list. But you can give me tips for that when the time comes.
Well, I'm not sure I know anything about novels either. I've learned that all books look the same. They share the same form factor, but they play by completely different like positioning rules, marketing rules. You know, like you were saying, is like I have no idea. There's types of nonfiction I would have no idea what to do with. It's like I'm in like a sub category.
When I first started publishing, I started going to the London Book Fair, and it was one of these huge events. And I remember walking around, and I had no idea what was going on. It was like this weird realization that you recognize all the publishers and the books. And I think, what the hell is everyone doing here? Because they're no customers. And then, someone obviously explained to me the whole rights situation and how that's how the money's made. And that's not relevant to me. But then I wandered into the sort of science and education publishing section. And I was like, oh, these are the people who know what they're doing. And it was, publishing those textbooks or those small annual update books, for legal firms or whatever, Lexis, all these companies, that's a real game. In terms of approaching publishers, I'm doing a course at Faber right now, novel writing course, which goes into how to publish and this sort of thing, which has been quite interesting from my perspective, being approached by writers. There does come a point where continuing to get in touch is not going to work in your favor. I remember another publisher telling me that he'll walk into bookstores and he'll know that the bookstores are getting something wrong. He knows that either he's published a product or someone else has that they could be selling and it would sell really well for them, but you can't do anything about it. It's the same thing with a publisher. If you have a great idea that makes sense for them and the publisher that you've reached doesn't think it's going to work, there's nothing you can do about it. You're not going to be the one to change their mind, which must be really hard. But I think equally, publishers have a certain amount of books they can publish every year. They have a certain budget. Find out where they go to the pub and just...
Yeah, we've been seeing a lot of people start doing like a transitional model where they self-publish until the book is de-risked, and then they go and they sell the rights, they pull down their self-published version, and 6 months later they get republished. That was how Nir Eyal got his start, and he sold a bajillion books and Business Model Generation and a bunch of other pretty popular books. People always worried that if they put it out themselves that no one's going to want to touch it after that. But if you put it out yourself and it does well, from the publisher's perspective, that's just extra information before they make their decision.
I think from the publisher's point of view, when I look at people to work with, obviously it's that they have the expertise that I need for this publication. Social media is not really that important to me. I can sell it through social media on my own. But if they have any experience presenting themselves with a similar product, then that's something that's important to me. This is someone who's going to speak about it eloquently. And if you know how to sell a product, then a bookseller is going to say, oh, great, I can send you around the country on a tour. And that's my job done. So I definitely think that if you can successfully self-publish something, absolutely. That's hard. It's much harder than what I'm doing.
So listen, Derek, your site is Blue Crow Media. Beautiful maps, beautiful stuff, excellent gifts, excellent way to discover a new city when you're traveling. We have now learned there is a newsletter. If you want to see how a indie publisher like Derek runs their newsletter and drives sales, hop on there, get some good examples. Any way we can help you, learn from you, chase you around the internet as enthusiastic fans.
If you have questions, I'm easy to find. There's a variety of email addresses on Blue Crow Media's website. They all go to me, despite the made up names that are before them. Publishing it's a really weird industry. And I don't think too many people recognize that. It's such a weird overlap of specialties and interests and failures, but it's certainly one worth exploring. It's interesting. It's a great way to make a living. I mean, if you can combine it with writing and doing what you love, then that's it. What else do you need? The first year will be like that. You got to make the mistakes. Isn't that how you've made your money, Rob?
Exactly.
Aren't you the king of mistakes or something?
Yeah, just keep doing things wrong. Try to find a way to monetize the failures after they've happened.
Nailed it. I love it. What a great way to have done it too,
Yeah, enthusiastically fumbling forward.